past 15 years, Amin Kably has worked for innovative, award-winning international world leaders in urban planning and design, project management, as well as land development. He has designed and planned new towns in Toronto, Guinea and Mongolia. He has also managed the preparation of master plans at a variety of scales, including participating in neighborhood, city and regional planning projects, such as the award-winning Amman Master Plan. His experience spans over 40 cities around the world, within North America, Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia and South Asia. Overall, he questions conventional strategies and is very conscious of the power dynamics within various urban and rural settings. He seeks to constantly redefine the profession to be more conscious of people's needs, which are rarely static in their particular contexts. He is a firm believer in indigenous knowledge, often finding himself within, but in opposition of compartmentalized institutional methodologies. He has a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Bombay and a Master of Urban Design from the University of Toronto, and has recently completed assignments for the EU in Egypt, the OSCE in Kosovo, and the UN in Lebanon, and the World Bank in Saudi Arabia.
Amin is actually a graduate of Kamla Raija College of Architecture, so he's your super senior in that sense. He was down in Mumbai and I met him at the State of Architecture exhibition, and that's when he told me he's doing a lot of work in Jordan. So I think his presentation will actually show you the length and breadth of his work, okay, where he was initially working with a firm and now he's started off on his own. So many of you all might move in that direction. Yeah?
Alright. Thanks, Ainsley. Thanks, Smriti. So, I'll get right into it. I mean, basically, this is a longer version of something that I'm going to be presenting on Friday in Prabha TV somewhere. So my talk is about inquiring into an understanding of life and people in relation to development intervention. I've highlighted a few life lessons derived from working on projects as an urban planner in a variety of contexts. And today I'll probably show some slides that are technical, but most of it is imagery trying to portray this 15-minute. So I'm doing this presentation, which is a 15-minute TED Talk version of on Friday. Anyway, so there's a talk on Friday. It's called Galloper Talks. I'm presenting over there a very short version of this. It's like a TED Talk 15-minute version of this presentation. Here I put in all sort of technical drawings and things like that. Because you guys are budding architects and planners and God knows what else. So it could be a little bit more relatable to what you're doing. So basically what I'm trying to do over here is I'm trying to focus on my approach generally and things that I've learned along the way. And I think whether you become architects or branch out in other fields, some of these may come in handy. So I'll talk about these 6 life lessons or also approaches to planning, development or even architecture projects that you could look into. One of them is life is right. Understanding a diverse set of layers, understanding the context, choosing minimal intervention, working at a variety of scales, and finding a middle ground. So let's start with life is right. You know Corbusier, I guess a lot of you know Corbusier. In 1925, around 1925, he built this worker housing in Bordeaux. And these houses were modified drastically by the people who were living in them over time. So that later on in life, he sort of commented, you know, it's life that's right and the architect who's wrong. So these images are from a critique that was done in the 70s by Philippe Boudon. It's a book called Lived in Architecture. So what I get out of it is life is not stagnant. So shouldn't architecture or planning be flexible to accommodate this? So let's talk about flexibility in planning from some of the places that I've worked in. I participated in the planning and design of a new town in Guinea for about 20,000 workers. This was about 10 years ago. And I was working for a company in Canada, as Ainsley pointed out. So we visited one of the towns there called KRVIA, and it was built in the 50s, and it was designed by what seemed to be a disciple of Corbusier. You know, they were replicating these modern building forms used in cities till today, the way Corbusier did decades earlier. And there were similarities down to the font in drawings. You've seen those Corbusier drawing fonts, and so it was here where I realized the importance of built environments to be flexible, to adapt to change to people's lives. So you'd see things like this. There were slab buildings which were completely out of context in this location, as it did not consider the rural lifestyles of the people. And families in these areas commonly expanded to about 10 people in Guinea. So people would take on a second wife, and there would be a family of 10 within years, as they succeeded and grew. And how can you imagine a family that starts out with 2 people growing into 10 inside an apartment here? People do it in Bombay and all, but you can only do so much, extend into your balcony and things like that. So people didn't need a stagnant space in a tower, is what my point is. So as in Corbusier's case in France and in Guinea, the towns that we had built in Africa had already matured. So we could easily observe these similar changes there. People had modified what they needed to suit their current situation. And this image shows some additions made to houses in Ghana built a few years earlier. The importance of flexibility in planning, again, to adapt to change as people's lives changed, was key. So I'll show a couple of images from the project that we had done in Guinea, and some of the studies that we had done. So people don't pay you to do research usually, but it's important that you give as much energy into understanding a place and the context. And in this case, in Africa and Guinea, we saw these towns. You see this image up here. It's of a town which was designed for about 20 or 30,000 people in the 70s. It's called Kamsar. And it grew along this major road leading to this port where it's built on. All along this road, it had about 120,000 people, and this is just about a span of like 20-25 years. So you can see the standard houses that were planned, and all the informal areas growing off it. Similar instances are happening in Bokeh, another older town, and in Sangaredi, which was closer to where we were building. Now, the other things that we were addressing in this town was the idea of construction workers. Now, you see it in Bombay as well over here, where you'll see construction workers from various parts of India coming in. They're building, they live temporarily around the site, and a lot of these places turn into slums. Like have you seen Cuff Parade? There's a huge slum development over there, and it's I think its roots were based on construction of the formal housing for the richer people in Cuff Parade, So this is what was happening in Guinea as well, and it happened in a lot of these towns, where a lot of these sort of trailers were put in sight, and they became permanent housing for people who got jobs from the economy of this town. So these are showing some of the sort of different building types and trailers, and what we wanted to do was accommodate that into the town. So here's an image showing typical trailers, housing anywhere between 8 to 30 people, giving each person like 4 or 5 square meters to live in. And there are a lot of single men who come in, and they're doing construction work on the town. So what we wanted to do is we had a number of housing types, and this was the most basic module of a housing type that we had. And what we showed was that they could have toilets, a number of toilets, a number of beds and things like that. Everything that these trailers accommodated inside the house, and just by changing the wet area into sort of a bathroom and kitchen, it turned into the starter house. And the plot sizes were all the same. So this house could expand into a larger house by looking at the larger building housing types. So we were allowing for that flexibility to happen without over-prescribing it for people in these cities. This massive spreadsheet is basically how we worked that out, where 5,000 construction workers were at the peak of building the town, and they would sort of slowly fizzle out, and those conversions would take place on those houses. So even the director's house, which was 250 square meters, would house 40, 50 workers if it was built during the initial phases and then converted. So this was the way of working that out and making sure that at the end we would house those many workers, 600 or 1,000 workers, which would turn into 20,000 people eventually in the town. So that's showing the partial first phase of the plan, where a lot of these were, it again quantifies that into this spatial diagram of the town. It was based on a plateau, like the town was on a plateau, and there were these green swaths. This was one of the first projects I had done where we, I'd traced out the town from scratch, worked on it in AutoCAD, and I learned how to draw it in AutoCAD, and I'd done all the drawings, a lot of client management, meetings, and finally, even when it came to the housing types, we had to hire architects and quantity surveyors to help us. We were a small office and small team. So I benefited a lot from these kinds of projects. This is for a company called Replan, which is now, which focuses on mining work. And I worked for this company which had Replan, Planning Alliance, Architects Alliance, and like all this together under one roof, where the same people would have different labels because people don't believe architects can do planning, and people in the mining sector, like social development, are not connected to architecture. So we're the same people, but it's just different labels. So that's again, these sort of final drawings of what the house looked like, and the entire town with the plot sizes, I think, are about 300 square meters. So even these sort of L-shaped houses, the bar house would turn into an L-shaped house, and later on as people progress, and there'd be different facilities. And the main road, as we saw in Kamsa, would populate itself with the market. We didn't have to do much there. We didn't have to build all these things. They would do it. The shelter, the livelihood, the amenities, according to the diverse cultural values. It was very important in understanding, because we had to plan for them. So no one gives you time to do it, but you need to spend time over them. So these, people's relationship with nature, how they moved around, all these layers provided a lot of background into these communities and their unique characteristics. So unless one understands all these layers, my point is, in relation to housing, transportation, employment, means, etc., one cannot make informed decisions to plan for and build for them. So here are some images showing different housing types. So these are more nomadic temporary shelters, which moved around as people farmed in different areas, wherever the rain fell. This is in Burkina Faso. Very, very simple houses. I can tell you some interesting stories about, before I went there was a guy in the office who was Latin American. And we had another project in, I don't know if it's Colombia or one of these, Dominican Republic. So this guy wanted to go to Dominican Republic. He started this project, and he had chosen a local architect over there. And he was criticizing that guy's work heavily before I was to go there. He's like, just check on this guy, he's not doing a good job of the houses. They look like they need some work and critique. And the houses were very simple, And when I went there and I saw what was dominantly being built, it was these square-shaped, simple objects with small holes for ventilation, because it's close to the Sahara, Niger border, and there's a lot of dust and wind. So the heat from the house was leaving the small openings near the roof, and I thought that the designs were completely appropriate. So it was interesting to me to see, as you transition from architecture, for myself, I got less interested in the details and the aesthetics of things, and I started appreciating other aspects of and giving people the opportunity to make their own decisions without enforcing these sort of aesthetic qualities into architecture and planning and all that. Anyway, these are just some images continuing the same idea about talking about different layers about understanding people's lives. Here's these areas, people were mining for gold artisanally. They didn't have many resources. It would rain 2 days in a year, with 500 millimeters of rain per year, and it would happen on 2 days. Those days I happened to be there when it happened. I'll show you an image of that as well. But people would collect, one of the things they would do to make money and survive over there was dig and create and sift through gold. So they'd tie a rope around a guy's leg, send him down a hole. Many people would die this way, by the way, and then they'd sell it. And there are these gold buyers. So They, he's weighing the gold with a matchstick over there. And very, very diverse cultures. There were more introverted villages versus villages that were, like I showed you before, more extroverted, and they move around. So this is some of the handicrafts that they were doing. Very beautiful people. Here's the dust storm before I was in a village, and the dust storm comes in, and they told me, okay, let's head back to your trailer. In 5 minutes, you're gonna get a shit ton of rain. So this is just before the rains. This is the more introverted community where they had compounds and they were rearing cattle. So you can see the transition from the more rural lifestyle to a more urban market that existed over there. And that's something I want to touch upon in terms of lifestyles as well when you're building for people. Like, you have to understand the rural landscape and the way people live, because cities are built and made up of people who depend on basic necessities. This is showing, infrastructure, for instance, in Ghana. This is showing movement. So transportation is not always this advanced way, what people consider advanced, technology-driven aspects of cities. Sometimes it can be as simple as understanding the way people move. And that was the plan. Maybe I should have shown it before, but this is the sort of rendering of the plan. And then we sort of handed it over to the client for construction, because they were building the mine as well, and it was they do the construction management. So that brings me to my next point, which is about context. So after completing my master's in urban design in Canada, I worked for a firm in a Canadian company, which I had spoken of earlier. And one of my first projects was to assist in the planning of a new town in Toronto. So that context is quite different from Africa as well, where in Toronto they had a similar colonial past to India. So, the marking of territory through surveying of lands, the forming of agreements with native people, all this is very familiar to us as well, as Indians. So it was particularly helpful in understanding the history of a place beyond the past 200 years that was obviously visible over there when I was there. And this context of also taught me about how native people in Canada moved around and lived sustainably off their lands until they were organized through colonization. Here's an image of one of the earlier surveys, and it's available on the Toronto website, the City of Toronto, and it shows the first concession. So what these guys did was basically the British surveyed the lands. They'd give themselves the first concession, and they populated by bringing in European settlers. So all the Dutch people who were in New York, for instance, they were gifted, hundreds of acres of land north of Toronto. So the British would take the first concession, then they'd give the Scottish, the Irish, the Dutch. People had, even the Europeans were given categories by the British. And basically gifted land, it kind of reminds you of Bombay being given by the Portuguese a dowry, it's like gifting someone else's. Anyway, so this is how Canada was surveyed and populated, and it's sort of a lot of urban areas like Toronto. So this is an old map of Toronto showing how it sort of subdivided over time. These urban areas became more and more densified. And here's an early image from the 50s where you have this hybrid between overly prescribed land tenureship and subdivision versus self-building. So people were self-building little worker houses for themselves. So even this occurred in Toronto, and now everything is an industry. Every house looks like this in Toronto, and they're all the same sizes, and some developer will build it, and there's a certain cost to it, and all the materials are cut in size and kept in a Home Depot, and this is how it's standardized, modernized version of the industry, or a building industry in Canada. They call it an industry. Anyway, all this was taken into account as context, what I call context of planning and designing this new town. And we wanted to make sure that all these ideas were reflected, restored, or recreated. All these were, the town had to reflect, restore, or recreate the nature that had been lost or subverted under colonization. So based on a very strong pre-colonial context and a post-colonial structure, here's the before and after aerial image of the town. and it's still being built, by the way. It's it's down to the final stages where when we finished the plan for it, it was given to developers. And there's a big story behind this one as well. This was an empty piece of land that the government sort of proclaimed in the 70s that we're going to build a new town here. So all the farmers filed cases against the government saying, we live here and we farm here, you know. So my boss at the time, who's the principal of the company, Planning Alliance, which is now called SVN, he had worked on the plan when he graduated in '74, and nothing happened of it because of the lawsuits against the government. And then in '95 there was a design competition for the town, and he won it, and he had done a plan for it again. And when I graduated and I started working, this was my first project as well, working with him, which is basically at its final stage. There was one last lawsuit against the government, and the idea was to plan it for the government and hand it over to the developers for building it. So what we ended up doing is we retained over 55% of the natural heritage. We retained about 1/3 of the land for agricultural use, which is basically this side of it. It's off the image, but basically that's all agriculture in perpetuity. And we retain some of we retain all the native burial sites from the native First Nations in Canada, and the villages that existed that were a agglomeration of farm dwellers. They call them hamlets. And we also use the hedgerows, which were basically trees dividing the original farms, as street trees, so retaining some of the memory of the farms that originally were allotted. So basically the point is, again, people's history and context is very important in any work that you undertake. Minimal intervention. So I'll talk about this, which is here. We had a lot of projects simultaneously, and this was about tsunami relief work in Indonesia. And basically, this shows a before and after image of the tsunami and earthquake that hit India as well in 2005, December 2005. And you can see how people lost their livelihoods within hours, and you know it was a very drastic situation over there. This we were hired by not-for-profit to do rebuild about 24 villages in an island called Simeulue, and we were also doing some work in Banda Aceh. So you've probably heard about this in 2005, Banda Aceh. Anyway, so this is the island in Simeulue, one of the islands. And what we as planners we didn't believe that we had to over-prescribe and build everything for people the way we did in Canada. So this is all about that. You know, these areas were rural in nature. They had a stronger sense of community, and those were the main strengths. So recognizing it was our duty. They had much more knowledge on how to organize and meet their own needs, even if we had been given the power to do so for them. After all, you know, they were able to plan their community and build their own homes before we came. So our intervention took this into account. And so besides formalizing land tenure on higher ground away from the coast, we also provided some observations on earthquake and tsunami resistance, but mainly we consulted with them and provided tools needed to make their own houses and canoes for fishing, etc. So that's a photograph of the tools. So this to me was one of the most important interventions. And I worked remotely on this project, but for me the biggest lesson here is minimal intervention is the best way forward in many cases. You know, in order for people to take ownership of something, they can sustain themselves over time, as opposed to planning everything down to the T. You know. So that brings me to I think one of the it's the second last part. You've got access and exposure to many different ideas apart from the formal syllabus taught. You know. So take advantage of it, explore things that you're interested in, and you know, I'm sure people will encourage it over here. This image is from Jordan in the 1940s. So I live in Jordan now. 3 years ago I quit my job in Canada, and I live in Jordan now. One of the projects we were doing, what brought me there was we were asked to do master plans. But so I'll sort of explain that. The image is from Jordan in the 40s. There were about 60,000 people at the time. It was basically a village, you know, not many years before that. And this is Amman in the 40s, like I said. And since then, Jordan has been at the receiving end of a massive influx of refugees. So it's surrounded by Palestine, and people have been displaced from Palestine for about 100 years now almost. And apart from that, there's Iraq, Syria, Egypt. It's surrounded by a lot of conflict since the First World War. So these unusual surges of growth over time is basically how Amman and Jordan was growing. And it was a quality which affected lives of both local and displaced people. So in the end, it's about people's lives and how they live, and what if we should do anything to intervene. So this is the result of the migration due to various conflicts in the region. It's reached about 4 million in the capital city of Jordan within a span of 75 years. So due to the increased stress on already scarce resources in the country, planning for growth seemed the best way forward for them, and we were asked to carry out master plans. So our approach was to work at the regional, the city, and the neighborhood scales at the same time to create a comprehensive plan for the next 25 years. And I found that the interdependency of planning at a variety of scales simultaneously allowed for an approach that ensured all decisions at a certain scale correlated to the larger scale seamlessly. I'll show you some images from so that's the regional plan, that's the city master plan, which is basically this yellow part, which is, we're saying this is what you should limit your growth to in the next 25 years. So that's the more detailed master plan of the city for the next 25 years. And these are, we did a number of these community plans where, we were initially asked to come and say, people are tearing down buildings and they're building high rises, what do we do? And, so we started out our planning work doing that, and we ended up doing an entire city plan with various layers, transportation, everything. And we also did a zoning bylaw which sort of set the parameters for rules of the architecture, which is all scales, working at them simultaneously, and they informed each other. And here again we talk about those layers that I was speaking of in the African projects. These layers existed in all those scales. The natural heritage system, forests, agriculture, rural areas, quarries and mining, mineral extraction, cultural heritage, settlements and expansion, which is basically housing. The social political context always comes into play for everything. Employment, where people worked, factories, institutions, all these are layers. You got to look at architecturally, at the city scale, regional scale, all of it. Institutions, open spaces, how people moved around again, transportation and transit, infrastructure, corridors and centers. So part of that project was a lot of different consultation, which you have to talk to people. You cannot just make decisions on them, and for them. And so if governments are hiring you to plan a city for them and help them manage the planning and building of a city over 25 years, you have to these things are what we did. The ongoing capacity building throughout the planning process. So we were training the staff who are architects like yourself in getting familiar with the planning scale. I did every project with these people, and they informed me as much as I was able to allow some input as well. But we trained them in GIS and building a GIS system. We consulted with the director of second to the minister, and the minister itself. We had consultation meetings. We had public meetings as well, and these focus groups. All this happened as well during the process of preparing the master plan, so that if we prepare a plan and leave, they're not going to be just lost and it won't just get shelved and kept somewhere. They were part of the decision making. They're part of the process. They understand everything fully, and they can carry the plan to wherever they want to carry it, whether they formalize it by law and say this is the plan and everyone has to follow it, or they use it as a methodology and an approach themselves, And both those things happen, by the way, in a lot of our planning in Jordan. So one of the things we did was, some people look at this as academic, but when you make it part of the process, it's very interesting. So, they had a lot of problem with sprawl. You can see the city just sort of sprawling out without any control, So this is Amman, by the way, and this we had to explain to a lot of people how rather than just expanding, you can densify by adding floors. You can intensify by filling in the vacant lots, and you can expand as well. So this is the regional plan. It's basically it shows the different layers and the level of detail that we talked about at the regional scale. The areas for expansion, the areas that are already built, which are in yellow. There are corridors where certain types of development would be encouraged. So this is basically organizing the city, you know, and employment areas, which are factories, large institutions, those sorts of areas. Natural areas, so limited and no growth areas are basically natural areas that needed to be retained. Cultural heritage, you know, old Amman, if you know, Jordan has a very strong Roman history and pre-Byzantine area history as well. So all these layers need to be retained, and as well as you know, croplands and rangelands. The difference between that is everything that's dark green is areas that are fed by rainfall throughout the whenever it rains in Jordan, and rangelands are area where people can use, again, their cattle can graze, and it happens also, you see it everywhere, as well as quarries and mineral areas. So those were that was the regional level. We also did organizing at the city level, which is here's a diagram from the city scale, showing how the city sort of grew. You know, they put employment areas outside the city at some point, but then the city has sort of grown around it. And this tends to happen with a lot of places. You cannot plan 50 years in advance and predict everything. So sometimes you have to replan things. So what we did is we organized the heavily classified, we organized all the industrial areas into heavy, medium and light, and we buffered the heavy industries with medium and light industries around it, so that those lighter industries would be, you know, just mechanics and things like that. Those would surround the would be adjacent to residential areas, and it wouldn't be toxic and unhealthy to residents and things like that. So that's the kind of planning that we had done. And any sort of minimal change where some factories had to be moved, that would happen over a 10-year period, and they would be classified as, you know, non-conforming. And the other thing is also criteria. You know, cities have certain budgets and money. You have to watch out for how you allocate that money, and we have to help them plan for that in action plan. So we classified the neighborhoods. We said that you concentrate on the areas that are built first, and you know, start putting your money into higher order transit, get people out of their cars, make them use buses, and create a viable transportation system. We created a whole department in the municipality as well. We did a lot of institutional building as well. So, you know, coming from architecture, you have to realize that you don't build always. You know, Ainsley and I were talking about this earlier. You know, like, you don't always build, and sometimes you have to not build. So this is all part of it, and planning has a lot of that, not building. This is an image from basically showing how, if actually this I should have shown earlier, it's connected to that image of expansion, intensification and densification. If they just expanded the way they did for the next 25 years, they'd use up all their municipal land, all their agricultural land, natural heritage, everything. So that's the way the expansion would look. If they intensified and densified, using higher floors and on some buildings, and utilizing all the vacant parcels in between that are just being speculated upon and not used, then they could retain their footprint and just expand a little bit and retain a lot of the agricultural land. So what we came up with was those two options, by studying all those neighborhoods and understanding and showing them how it was very realistic to think of it that way as neighborhoods matured. And we came up with an in-between solution of what the overall density of the city would be, and you know, this is the way forward. So we got political buy-in from people higher up making decisions, saying, okay, this is what we're going to go for, so let's plan for this, very early on in the process. So finally, I'll talk about this last approach, is finding a middle ground. So from my travels, it was clear that cities have become a concentration of the growing disparity between rich and poor, as well as the receiving end of massive growth in population. So people are either displaced from conflict, as we saw in Amman and Jordan, or looking for opportunity, causing major rural-urban migration. So recently I was asked to give advice about informal settlements to Balkan countries. So in Pristina, Kosovo, this is an image of Mother Teresa Boulevard. She's actually from Albania, so they they have a boulevard named after it. It's all pedestrian. It doesn't show any informal areas, but I kind of liked it, so I showed it. And so I went for this conference to give them advice on informal areas, so basically slums in their countries. And the countries that were represented in the Balkans that were there was Kosovo, Serbia, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and different governments and things like that. And I had to give them advice, so I showed them what I had learned in informal areas in the Middle East. So I've been doing a lot of independent work lately for different organizations, World Bank, the EU. So I get these short assignments in different countries. So if I was hired, for instance, in Egypt to do energy efficient urban planning guidelines for all new cities in Egypt. When I was there, I saw 70% of people in Cairo live in informal areas. So they don't look like Dharavi or something like that, but they're more permanent in structure, but there's an entire informal market that grew from the 50s. So we refer to them as slums. There are all these derogatory terms, but what I want to say is also, sure they have their problems, and sanitation, health issues, but people are always people have created their own self-planned solutions. I call them self-planned areas instead of informal areas. So they've been creating their own solutions for housing and employment needs for decades. Here's images from Egypt. People have been doing it in Lebanon, which has a similar condition as Jordan. A lot of influx of refugees. You can get tumors and things like that being exposed to these electrical frequencies as well. Jordan, a lot of Palestinians who came in from 1947, 1960, they also built a lot of their own houses. Saudi Arabia, you'd be surprised, they've got 61 informal areas in Jeddah. They got 47% of the land in Medina is people who came there for pilgrimages and sort of just settled. And they use Sharia law to sort of justify that. In Yemen, I'd done some master planning work for the city of Sana'a, and you could see these images of, this is before the chaos that's happening right now over there, but you can see people marking out their lands and they're settling informally on steep slopes. So, it happens everywhere. So, people have to, here's, some more imagery actually showing Egypt, for instance. This is Cairo. People settle near the river as a resource for water and everything near the Nile for about 5,000 years. So that's the Nile. And this is the city of Cairo, just sort of built around it right now. And you can see what's the informal city, which is 70% of the population live on like 35% of the land. So, and the rest is just sprawl, and 30% of them live in there. So people have lived there for thousands of years. Since the 1950s industrialization policy, a lot of rural-urban migration caused growth also, and there was a shortage of housing. So they created their own solutions, and it's become into a market. You can see how the city, this used to be a village, this circular area over here, and this is all farm plots, and the city is down here. It's sort of joining up and maturing over time, and it's just this is how things are organically growing from a rural edge fabric into a mature one through self-planning and integration, I say. And there are different differences. It's a very complicated issue. A lot of people are dealing with it and things like that, but they're not really dealing with it because it continues to exist as an informal market. Like here are images of nicer looking informal areas, and there are other areas that are in worse condition because they're on government land. So all these sort of politics and policies affect how people live and their built form as well. Even in these self-planned areas, it's important to know all this. But my main point with all of this was to recognize the positive aspects of these areas. So we can learn a lot from people's ability to provide themselves with their own solutions. So as opposed to being this sort of architect that decides on everything. It connects again to what Corbusier was saying right in the beginning, where, according to global standards for city building, these areas, they're demand driven. So there's an image of a mature informal area in Egypt. So things are built over time, and they're demand driven. They're flexible to expand as the population's needs grow. unlike regulations that we put in as planners, where one size fits all, it's incremental in growth, so it's matured over time to serve the community well. It's compact, high density, so it's efficiently using land and resources. It's self-sufficient. They're mixed-use areas, so it's central for jobs, services, and amenities. It's low energy consuming, so these areas are primarily pedestrian areas, so they're not using the car. It's energy efficient. They don't have the resources to buy cars to begin with, so when these areas are planned, it's planned for pedestrians. It's cleaner to breathe the air in these areas than the planned areas of the city and suburbs and these kinds of things. And they're socially cohesive. People, their families grow. They want to live near their relatives. So they're a community that's grown over time, slowly. So this is basically what I want to conclude with. Basically saying that as planners, when I had given advice to people in Kosovo, I was able to tell them, I had to remind them how their cities were once informal, and suggest that maybe it's time they stop looking at illegal building as constantly as something as in need of repair, but rather they need to adjust their approach to accommodate the positive aspects and find a middle ground. So I'll end with Dharavi, talking about how it's a home to 1 million people, and they recycle 80% of Bombay's plastic. They, you guys know that this stuff. They generate $1 billion per year. So they're doing something right. We're doing something wrong, as planners. So if I can end with one last conclusion, it would be overall what I've learned is that in order to understand people's needs, you need to re-reflect who you are and inquire into what influences you, your bias, etc. And constantly question it. Planning is a big responsibility to represent people's needs and balance those with the intent of paying clients. If governments hire to plan for the future of cities to enable them to manage it better, or companies hire to plan and design and build a new town, it's your responsibility to understand people's needs. So the journey so far has provided me with various perspectives into urban and rural living and life. And I hope to continue to reflect this in my work in years to come. Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions? Anyone?
Was that too long? They're just saying,
The plans that you showed, the town plans.
Yeah.
So they were. How do you orient yourself in a place like that? Say, in one of the plans there was a school in one corner.
Yeah.
So then you can orient yourself that okay, I need to do this. My house is near the school. And in plans where you have houses which look very similar to one another and there are multiples of them, then how can you orient? What strategies do you use to orient yourself?
So this is acting as an architect or a planner and planning for it, or orienting yourself when you go to these places? Just ask people, ask around. Like, talking to people are the best thing. Like, they're the ones who live there and plan.
But in many of the downtowns where such places are being made, it's really hard to orient yourself because a lot of houses look similar. And there are no markers as such in the landscape. So.
Usually it's like for some people, it's a very good question. Like it reminds me of how do you define a neighborhood? Some people say I live in Pravali, So where does it end and where does it begin? How do you orient yourself in a place? But it's usually, like I said, you ask people and they'll tell you what the landmarks are. It's mostly that there are landmarks. And they'll say there's a store over there, or there's this old tree, which looks like this. And there's an apple tree there, more rural areas. So if you ask and you observe, you'll see how people orient themselves. You have to use the same way of orienting yourself. Like in Jordan, when we were working, there were people who didn't have any, they weren't used to reading maps and things like that. And whether I defined a neighborhood according to the government municipal boundaries, it didn't mean anything to them. Like, they'd be like, for Jabal, like on top of the mountain. So they oriented themselves from these hills that existed way before it was urbanized. So you get up on top of the hill, and that's where I live. Like, just head towards the top of the hill. Usually the roads, the older roads, were just planned. They'd send a donkey out, right? And the donkey would take the easiest path, which would circle around the hill. So people still oriented themselves that way because their culture is so strong that it retained itself over time. So that's how they
in the end, we said that Dhara was doing something right in terms as a flourishing economy. What are points about Dhara that make it more?
I think y'all would know that better than I would because I've been away for so long. But what I've read a lot of the books and publications that you guys have done here, and I've read about this, and how people are. It has a history also. It started off as a very socially cohesive place. It was a fishing village, and so these things get retained. They're the people who are in the tanning industry, and they all know each other, and it's a community. Some of them live by that. Some live by caste and religion. There are ghettos and things like that happen in a lot of places. But the qualities of it that you find that you won't find anywhere else are the characteristics of orienting yourself while you're in there. There are qualities in it that are not aesthetic that you have to learn to appreciate as well. Things like the economy and recycling plastic. I think it's a big benefit to the city. So, those are just some of them. That's what I know of. I wish I knew more than this.
What I saw from the presentation is that you worked across a lot of countries of different diverse cultures across the map, and so what I wanted to ask is that how do you set yourself for these differences in the countries that you work with? So if there's African people you work with, and simultaneously you're working in Canada, and then there's a project in Yemen, and there was a Kurdistan, and so like I was trying to relate it with the work we do here. So if it takes a month for us to understand our side context and the way people function and live in the side that we get, so how do you set yourself for when you have like so many layers, so many people to understand, and then work for the project and build or not build all at one time?
So very early on in the project, you have to make a case for it, but you don't make the case for it as it was the right thing many times. Many times people don't want to, they like the bottom line. So you find out, you have to understand your client or who's paying you to do this work, and find out what their bottom line is, and translate these important things into their bottom line and their profits. So for instance, in Africa, if a mining company hires you to, like, they just want to pull rocks out of the ground, they're a mining company. So they don't care about people, but what they do, like, it starts off with them having a riot because people are unhappy and they're treated badly. And you're the person responsible for making decisions on their behalf, hired by them. So you say, okay, you want to prevent a riot and your mine stopping for 20 years, then spend 1 year in understanding them, do a social impact assessment. This is what it involves, and this is how much time it takes, and this is what you're going to get at each stage. Sometimes they don't even care when you produce it. Like I was fighting with clients over there about communal retreats. Like they say, okay, it costs $10,000 to create a 10 toilets in one shot, and 100 people can use it. So we save in the end $75,000 instead of giving them individual toilets in their plant. And I'm like, they're not going to use it.
What do you really mean by informal city?
Yeah, I mean, this is what so basically people call Dharavi a slum, right? People over there call that informal areas. And I call all of them self-planned communities. So it's just a matter of defining it really. But the difference to me that's very drastic is Dharavi has more of its fabric is temporary in nature, things that people found within. It's the economy here and the gap between the incomes between the rich and poor and what people have to work with is much less. There you got doctors, policemen, all living in the informal areas. So there's a market there. They know where to go to and where the illegality happens in land tenure, where agricultural land is being used for building, and no setbacks are made for cars. rules and regulations that have been created over time, if you look through the roots of it, it's the same in Egypt as in Bombay and anywhere else. Some British guy in 40s said, here's the Town and Country Planning Act and this is the rules that you're going to follow. You want to be questioning it. So this is the barrier that we face. I think I answered your question about the
I mean, I don't understand what would make a part of the city formal or informal. How would you?
So the way they define informality is just basically illegal land tenure, so, or illegal use of it. So a land is owned as agriculture, not residential. They're putting a building on it. That's illegal. Anything else? So all you guys are second year, third year? And who's third year? And who else is in first years, fifth year, fourth years? Are you all involved in the design cell? I wish I was. I wasn't when I was here. I would have learned so much because everything is more intense over here. You know, like in India, everything happens like 10 times more. You know, like, it's a Bollywood exaggeration of something in Bombay also. You know? So, I don't know. You can really learn a lot over here. It's a good environment to learn it. So you know, you'll find understanding things outside easier. But of course, you got to pay due diligence and try to understand it.
Are there any more questions? Thank you for being here. I'm sure we've appreciated it.